All right, folks. Today we are finally looking at efficiency in taxes. Um, so we're going to see what happens to these graphs that we've been talking about when it's efficient. We're going to talk about what that means, and then we're going to take a look at what it means when there is a tax placed on this market. So we start with, what does it mean exactly when these markets are efficient? Well, what it means is you're in equilibrium. Your surpluses are maximized. Your supply meets demand. That is the basic idea for equilibrium that we are going to use throughout this course. It's where your supply, and this is your societal supply, meets your societal demand. That societal stuff will come in play at the very end of the course. But for now, just know that this is um, where supply meets demand. And your surpluses are maximized here. So your total surplus is maximized where supply meets demand. Um, Now, what happens when you throw a tax into that? We've already talked a few times about efficiency and what happens when you mess with the market. A tax messes with the market, and so it does cause inefficiency. Absolutely. There is not a single economist that is going to say that it doesn't, but they're designed to increase equity. So you could, at least some are designed to increase equity, at least if they're done well. Now, that can be either through targeted taxes to try to decrease a behavior that you don't want, such as cigarette smoking or something like that, or it can be to somewhat uh, even the scales a bit, redistribute, if you will. So there's three types of taxes if we talk about income. Um, Progressive tax. This is what America uses, at least before we factor in loopholes and things like that. So we're just going to take our straight tax rates. Um, we have a progressive income tax. What this means is the higher income pays a larger percentage of that income. Now, it's not the total income. So it's not I make $100,000 a year and pay 80% of that in taxes. That doesn't make any sense. Instead, what it is the money is taxed at a marginal rate. So the idea is your first 100,000 is taxed at a rate of, I'm just going to throw out a random number, 5%. Your second 100,000 is taxed at 20%. Your third 100,000 is taxed at 25%. So it's just those individual buckets of money that get taxed at higher rates. So when people are saying we need a 90% tax on the rich, and people making billions of dollars, they're not saying that whole billions of dollars gets taxed. They're saying the marginal rate in between the one tax bracket and the next, that bucket of money that would get filled, if you consider it like buckets, that would get taxed at 90%, not the whole income itself. So that's what we mean by a higher income individual will pay a larger percentage of their income. A regressive tax is the opposite. Higher income pays a smaller percentage of their income in taxes. Now, this could be done not even necessarily through an income tax. So we'll talk about regressive taxes mainly through sales taxes. If I am paying a sales tax on my on anything really, um, say it's sales tax in Pennsylvania is 6%. So if I buy a $10 item, 6% of that I have to pay in taxes. That takes up a larger percentage of my income than it does anybody who makes more money than me. So that is considered a regressive tax. The last one is the one that sounds like a good idea for most people, but most serious economists don't actually support it, and that's the proportional tax. This sounds the best because it sounds so easy. It sounds like treating everybody equal. It's where you have everyone pay the same percentage of their income. So whether you make $100 a year or you make $1 trillion a year, you pay the same percentage. Now that might sound like a good thing. It sounds simple, easy, and equal amongst everybody. But what you have to consider with proportional taxes is even though proportionally the percentage is the same, it works out a bit different because if you make $100 a year, 10% of that is, $10. That means a lot to you if you only make $100. So proportional tax might use the same proportion, but that 10% there means a lot to somebody who only makes 100. If you make $1 trillion, not that 10% means nothing to you, but it means a whole lot less than that person who makes 100. And that's why most economists say proportional taxes aren't really the way to go. Most economists would say progressive taxes are the way to go. And this goes for conservative economists and liberal economists. They both generally say that progressive taxes are the best outcome. Now, when you're looking at the effect on the market, so we're going to put aside income taxes for a second and just take a look at what's called an excise tax. And so this is a tax levied on each unit of a good is sold. So it's almost like a sales tax, but it could be done, before it gets to you, if you want to think of it that way. So it's before it gets sold to you as the consumer. So what happens here is there is a change in total surplus, and there is going to be a way to demonstrate tax incidence. Now, if you look at the graph here, you see we have our basic supply and demand graph, and we have our deadweight. You see a deadweight loss, you see a consumer surplus, and you see a producer surplus. That looks a lot smaller than what we had talked about previously. This actually looks a lot like a quantity control, like a quota. And that's essentially how you got to treat this. So what I want you to do when you graph it out, when you graph a tax, what occurs is you effectively shift supply to the left. Remember when we talked about supply and shifters of supply, I said taxes are something that will effectively shift supply to the left, treat it like an increase to input prices. And that's what you see here. So if you treat your market here as if that's occurring, you have supply shifting to the left. You have a new quantity sold. Your new quantity sold is going to be where your new supply curve meets your demand curve. So that is your quantity T as described right here. The price that consumers are going to be paying is going to be the same found at the same spot. It's where your new supply curve meets your demand curve on the y-axis. So if you take a look, supply is right here, demand is right here. Take that dotted line over to the y-axis. That's the price consumers pay. Now I said you treat this essentially like a quota, how you're looking at quantity controls. So what you do is you take that quantity, go down to your old supply curve. So you take that quantity, you go down to your old supply curve, and that's how we got this box, if you will. And so there is the price producers receive. So just like in quotas, where we had a price consumers pay and a price producers receive, we have that same setup now. There's a few key differences, but let's start with the similarities first. Our consumer surplus has shrunk, just like in our quotas, and it's still found by the price consumers pay, the y-axis, and the demand curve. So our consumer surplus has shrunk. It used to be found where equilibrium was, the y-axis, and the demand curve. So it used to be that full triangle. Now it's much smaller. Same thing found with the producer surplus. The price producers receive, the supply curve, and the y-axis. It used to be found by equilibrium, supply curve, y-axis. So you see that it shrunk there. You do have deadweight loss again because there are transactions that aren't occurring because we're now moved away from our equilibrium. So how do you find that? That's your new quantity, the demand curve, the supply curve. That's why this triangle in here is the deadweight loss. Once again, if you want to quantify it, you just find the area of that triangle, just the same way that to find out the consumer surplus or producer surplus, you find out the areas of those triangles. To find the total surplus, you add those two. Now, what is the difference in this? Well, a lot of it has to do with terminology. So first of all, how much is the tax itself? If you want to measure per unit, how much is the tax itself? Well, it's the difference between the consumer price and the producer price. So if you just take those two numbers, subtract them, that's the tax. If you want to find out how much per unit of the tax the consumer pays, you use the equilibrium, your original equilibrium, as your dividing line. So that tells you per unit, consumers pay that much of the tax, producers pay that much of the tax. Now, how much in total, once all the sales are done, do consumers pay versus producers? Well, you just find the area of the rectangle in the box. So consumers pay this area using the equilibrium as the dividing line of that rectangle. So the consumer price, the quantity, the old equilibrium, the y-axis. Producers, the producer tax incidence, same idea, equilibrium, quantity, price producers receive, y-axis. Those are called tax incidences. It tells you who pays more of the tax in total. So consumer tax incidence is the area of that rectangle. Producer tax incidence is the area of the lower one. Now it could ask you per unit, and then it's found by the one on the side. Now, who bears the larger burden really has to do with the elasticity of demand and supply. So if you have a, just want to check. Yeah. If you have a perfectly inelastic demand curve, so if you think about that for a second, a perfectly inelastic demand curve, then consumers will pay the total burden of the tax. And that makes sense because they're going to buy the same amount no matter what. So if demand is more elastic, consumers pay a greater amount. If supply is more inelastic, then suppliers pay a greater amount. So that's how you have to think of it. Who has the greater inelasticity? Who has less flexibility in terms of what they are doing in the market? If suppliers have more flexibility, they pay less of the tax. If consumers have more flexibility, they pay less of the tax. Now, if we look at what it means for total surplus, a tax on producers is going to shift supply to the left, as we said. A tax on consumers will shift demand to the left. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. Demand, I don't want you to focus on. You can formulate different taxes that will do that, obviously. But what I really want you to focus on and why it's in bold is the one that we just did, the tax on producers shifting supply to the left. In either case, the tax leads to a decrease in quantity, an increase in price paid by consumers, and a decrease in price received by sellers. There is then the wedge between the price consumers pay and the price producers receive, and that's equal to the amount of the tax as we just talked through. Now, to just formalize those notes on elasticity, if we have a relatively inelastic demand curve for this good compared to a relatively elastic demand supply curve, then consumers pay more. So the more inelastic you are, the greater burden you have. It can be flipped. If demand is relatively elastic and supply is relatively inelastic, then suppliers pay the greater share of this tax. Now, maybe you're saying, but Mr. McNair, didn't you just say this tax was on producers? Doesn't that mean that they should pay the whole thing? Well, maybe up front, but what happens is they then pass along that price increase to you. So even though there might be a tax on a good and that might be paid by producers, eventually that trickles down to consumers. So in many cases, you will have suppliers passing it along or passing along the whole thing. If you have sort of our extremes of elasticity, then you will have certain groups paying the full amount of tax. So if demand is perfectly inelastic, then consumers pay the whole amount of tax. If um, if supply is perfectly inelastic, then suppliers uh, pay the full amount of tax. By the same token, if demand is perfectly elastic, then suppliers pay the whole amount of the tax. And if supply is perfectly elastic, then consumers pay the whole amount. So you do have to kind of look at them both that way. So what are the benefits and the costs of this? Well, first, the benefits, revenue. Governments need revenue. That's just what you need. That's how governments function. You could also say certain taxes, hopefully, for certain groups, would help them out. It would give them benefits in terms of redistribution, if that's something that you consider a goal of the government. If not, you might consider that a cost. You might consider it a bad thing. But um, many people would consider that good. If we're looking at other costs, more economic costs, really, we're looking at deadweight loss. We're looking at the loss of transactions. We're looking at administrative costs that go into it as well. And those administrative costs really depend on the type of tax, how it's implemented, where it's implemented, the bureaucracy behind it. And, is it a well-functioning bureaucracy or a not well-functioning bureaucracy? So just as a quick review before we end this lecture, if you look at this graph just to see what these different areas mean. Now, if you draw in your second supply curve, like I did on the last graph, so we imagine a tax shifting supply to the left. We have our new quantity set by our new supply curve and demand. The new intersection of supply and demand gives us our consumer price, which is PD here. If you take that intersection, that new quantity, go down to your old supply curve, that gets you your price producers receive set by PS right here. That gives us our general setup. So if we draw in our lines at consumer, the price consumers pay, y-axis demand curve, this area A is the consumer surplus. If we do the same thing down here for the price producers receive, supply curve, the y-axis, D is the producer surplus. Our deadweight loss is our quantity, our supply curve, our original supply curve, and our demand curve. So this area that's E and F, that is all deadweight loss. You don't have to know any split between that. If we want to know the amount of the tax, it's PD minus PS. That is our tax. If we want to figure out per unit, what is the tax incidence on consumers, it's PD minus P0. If we want to find that out on producers, it's P0 minus PS. If we want to figure out the total revenue that goes to the government, it's the area of this green rectangle, B and C. So this whole rectangle formed by those areas are B and C. If you want to find out the tax incidence in total of consumers, it's the area of B, and the producer tax incidence for total sales is the area of C. So that's it. I know taxes can be kind of confusing, but it's one of those things where enough practice with it, enough looking at it, especially if you got it with when we did quotas, this should look very familiar to you and sort of come quickly. If not, this is something that you will need to practice. Just looking at graphs, formulating them yourselves, making sure you know what all the areas and spots of it mean, because it is a kind of common question for the AP test, where they give you a graph like this, and then you're asked to identify different spots on it. So make sure that you can draw the graph and identify everything on it. and then know what happens when things get manipulated on the graph. So if demand becomes more inelastic, well, then you should see consumer surplus shrinking, producer surplus increasing. You should be seeing um, the tax incidence shifting more towards uh, consumers. That's the type of thing that you should see. So be able to manipulate graphs, and as I always say, when in doubt, graph it out because that'll help you immensely. All right, thanks.